Well, thanks everybody, and thanks Left Horizons for inviting me to do these three presentations on the basics of Marxist or Marxian economics. I don't really argue about the adjective too much. You'd be surprised how many Marxist academics do argue about the adjective, but that's an example of complicating the process of trying to understand some basic points about the nature of capitalism, the nature of the relationship between capital and labor. And so in this presentation, starting off with the theory or law of value that Marx expresses in the very early pages of volume 1 of Capital, I'm not going to deal with criticisms in any great detail raised against Marx's theory of value. I want to discuss what Marx says, as far as I understand it, is his law of value and why it's relevant to a capitalist society. Okay, so the theory of value, first in this presentation. And Marx doesn't talk about exploitation when he opens up Capital at the beginning. In fact, he talks about the nature of commodities. And the reason he does that is he wants to explain the difference between the things that we use and need and produce and the things that we use and need and produce that are sold in a market. And he makes the distinction, therefore, between products, things or services that we need or use or produce, and things that we sell on the market, which he calls commodities. So the opening line of Karl Marx's Capital is the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. And the individual commodity is its elementary form. It gives us the basic understanding of Marx's law or theory of value. So human beings have always labored to make things, tools, food, clothing, shelter, in order to survive. Things are manufactured, mined, or grown, but they were not commodities, however, as long as they were made for directly being used by the person who made them or were given away in gifts in some form. They were not sold on the market. And so Marx's definition of a commodity is something that is made through human labor, satisfies the demand that human beings have for it, but it's produced for the purpose of exchange. So if I bake a loaf of bread to eat, then it's just bread. But if I bake it in order to sell it, then the loaf becomes a commodity. So commodities are not made for the personal consumption of workers or bosses of a particular business. They're made for the purpose of exchange. That is to be bought and sold. So, in order to understand the nature of a commodity, Marx says there's two parts to the value of a commodity: the use value and its exchange value. And what are the difference between a use value and the exchange value in a commodity when we're looking at the value of a commodity? The use value of bread is that it provides food, it's nourishment. The use value of a chair, which I'm sitting in now, is that it can be sat upon. Everything has a use value if it's useful to someone. Different degrees as we'll find out how much they think that's worth, how useful that is, but everything has a use value if it's useful to someone. So every commodity has a use value, otherwise it couldn't be sold because nobody would see that it had any use. All societies have produced use values, not necessarily commodities to be exchanged. They produce them for their own use or for other people's use without any actual exchange on the market taking place. And indeed, some use values still exist that are not commodities, like air, at least not yet. Water has been commodified, but not air so far. But we cannot determine the value of a commodity by its use value. We can't know how much it's worth. Everybody's view about something, a piece of bread, a chair, has a different subjective level of usefulness, depending on the time, depending on the nature of the table, depending on the sense of the human being looking at it. It's very subjective and it varies. Now, a capitalist doesn't really care what an item's use is and how it subjectively it has any use value to anybody. All they're interested is, can I turn this product into a commodity that I can sell that makes money? So what matters for the capitalist then is the exchange value. What is the value I can get on the market in price in terms of money? The quantity of which, in other words, this one commodity that he's selling exchanges for another commodity or for money. So the theory of value, the labor theory of value that Marx argues is, how do we measure the value of things on exchange? And we need to measure it. Capitalists certainly need to measure it in order to judge what price they think they can get for it, what money they can get for it. And also, as far as we are concerned as workers, we have to know what the value of our own labor power is in order to get a wage. So how do you compare, say, a block of cheese with a bike? Not by its weight. It's not a question of the weight of the bike compared to cheese. Not by its size. That's not how markets would sell cheese against a bike. Nor by its content, whether it's food or whether it's a piece of metal. The one property that all commodities have in common, and this is what Marx discusses in the early chapters of his Capital, is through which their value can be determined, is that each is a product of human labor. In Marx's words, despite their motley appearance, cheese, bikes, all sorts of different commodities, they have one common denominator. Commodities can exchange according to the relative amount of labor time it takes to produce them. That's his fundamental basic point that he's making for us to judge the exchange value of any commodity. And that exchange value, therefore, is a quantitative representation of value. Roughly, for example, if it takes 10 times as long to make a chair as it does a loaf of bread, then that chair will be about 10 times more valuable. If you make a pie, it will be of use to you if you eat it, but if you put it up for sale, it has no exchange value. But the pie cannot have an exchange value if it does not have a use value. So it's got to be edible in order to somebody to be able to sell it to somebody else. It's of use to you to eat it, but from the point of view of the capitalist, he's interested in what exchange value he can get if he sells it. Let's give you a little bit of an example of the difference between use value and exchange value. In May 2018, some pages of Marx's first draft of Capital, in fact, the commodities part of that draft, were put up for auction in Beijing, and a multi-millionaire Chinese bought some 1,200 or so pages of Marx's notes made between 1850 and 1853 for just over $500,000. By the way, also put up was Engels' article for a particular military magazine, which went for half that. So you could say that the exchange value in the case of Marx's notes was twice as much as Engels's exchange value for his notes. But how much time was involved can vary quite considerably depending on the use value seen here. And therefore, if you take it, when Marx wrote those notes, it was just had use value for him. It was when it went into the market, you were able to achieve some sort of exchange value as a result. But the essence of value, Marx is saying, is how much labor time goes into it. And there's a famous quote he makes where every child knows a nation which ceased to work, I will not say for a year, but even for a few weeks would perish. And we know that as we've seen in the COVID slump. Every child knows too that masses of production products corresponding to the different needs require different and qualitatively determined masses of the total labor of society. Science, the science of Marx's economics or science of economics, consists precisely in demonstrating how the law of value asserts itself in a capitalist economy. And the first thing we have to remind ourselves is that Marx makes a distinction when we're looking at the labor time involved in the production of things and services. There is concrete labor and abstract labor. Labor has a dual character, like the commodity has a dual character. The commodity has a dual character between use value and exchange value, the use for it, and what you can get on the market by selling it. Similarly, labor has a dual character as well, between concrete and abstract labor. What do we mean? Well, every person's work is a bit different. They can produce many different things depending on their skills. So the quality of their labor varies. Marx called this concrete labor. The labor produced will be different depending on who's doing it and what they're actually producing. But that labor must fit into the production process of commodities for sale on the market across the board. It can't just remain as specific to a certain time, place, and a person producing it. The concrete labor of each worker therefore becomes abstracted into hours of work on an average level of skill to meet the requirements of capitalist production. Now it is the quantity of labor time that matters, not its quality, not its type, not its concrete character, to use the top right-hand photo, but actually how much quantity of labor time goes into produce it across the board, given an average level of skill in a particular capitalist process of production. So labor is both concrete and abstract in the capitalist production, and every concrete skill that we have is reduced to the labor time involved for production and sale under capitalism. So that also means there's a difference. People often say, what's the difference? Surely there's more labor time, more value in skilled work, the quality of skilled work compared to unskilled work. And Marx says, yes, all labor creates value. So it costs a certain amount of human labor time at a certain rate. A 1 hour of labor time will be at a rate similar to another hour of labor time on the process of production for commodities and exchange. But skilled labor does transfer a proportion of previously accumulated sum of labor time. Therefore, the machinist or the skilled worker, the doctor, the technician and so on, includes physical hours worked at the time, but also incorporates the hours used in the skills in the first place to get that person a level of skill. The teachers, the textbook makers, the trainers, the drafters, they've contributed to the education and preparation of, say, a Boeing worker and his skill to produce an aircraft rather than somebody just digging a hole. There is a difference there, but that extra skill is incorporated through the accumulated sum of labor time from the educationists and trainers before. So there's no real argument to make it difficult to use labor time as an explanation of the quantity of value and therefore the money or the price that goes into a product between skilled and unskilled labor. But not all labor is equal to the same amount of time in terms of the price of products. The value of a commodity is only equal to the quantity of abstract labor time. So it's got to be socially necessary for the production of a commodity in question. The labor time socially necessary that's required to produce an article or a service under normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So that if I sit down and decide to make my own table, it's going to take much longer than a factory with skilled workers. So my opportunity of selling that table, if it looks exactly like the one produced in the factory and is the same, is going to be very, very difficult because the factory produced table with skilled workers is going to produce in a lot less time and therefore is almost certainly going to be at a lower price than I could charge for the number of hours that I've had to spend making all the mistakes to produce my own table. So there has to be a sort of average level of skill in order to produce something, and it has to be produced at a certain level of production that makes it socially necessary. So, for example, Leonardo's painting may be worth $450 million in November 2017, or Van Gogh's vase of flowers may be worth $40 million in 1987, $74 million apparently now, but they're not great numbers of hours have gone into that. These have got huge prices because they're unique. They're not a process of continual production for commodity production. What is commodity production actually is the print of Van Gogh's picture. So the factory production of Van Gogh's picture comes in at about £30 because that's the average number of hours using the equipment, the photography equipment and so on, the printing process and whatever on a mass scale to be sold on the market in general amounts to produce the amount of time it takes. The £30 therefore represents on average the amount of labor time in money terms that is taken to produce a print of Van Gogh's paper. Another aspect of this labor theory value is the difference between living and dead labor, as Marx called it. So a value of a table, a jetliner or an iPhone must include not only the amount of labor time that have been put into producing it, but also the materials, the tools and the technology used in the production, from whether it's wood, turbines, microchips. So Marx said the living labour is the amount of human labour time that goes into the production of the commodity in a certain period, and the dead labour is where previous labour has produced the tools and components, and we take that extra labour, that value, the raw materials and so on, is passed on to the value of the new product, the table. So the table's value will be the amount of labour time that the worker has put into producing it, and also the labour time that went into working up the raw materials, the wood, the timber and so on, to produce the table, and also a certain amount of the value of the equipment that's added to be necessary to saw the table up. And that will, because that equipment doesn't disappear in just one period, then it's just a fraction that's used. Eventually you replace the saw when it wears out, but you can add that to the value of the table as well. But that's dead labour. It's not creating new labour. That value is being produced in the past. So it's only passing on the value that was already created. Only human beings starting to work again and produce the table are adding new value to the existing amount of timber that's in front of us. Where does money fit into this? Marx says that money crystallizes out of this process of exchange. So there's continual exchange of commodities. It's a very complicated, you can't exchange 10 cows for 2 horses or 15 books for 1 automobile. You've got to have some sort of easy way, convenient way of carrying out this process of exchange. And that's where money appears. Money, therefore, is a substitute for barter. It can be a commodity, starting with cowrie shells, could be silver. Generally, internationally, it's been gold over a period of time. And later on, we've actually moved on to paper money. And now money is actually just digital. It's in bank reserves and even more reduced just to units in a computer. But with money, a producer of bread doesn't have to go to the marketplace with 10 loaves of bread in order to buy a chair. At the same time, a chair maker doesn't need to exchange the chair for 10 loaves of bread if she only wants one today and another loaf later in the week. So money conveniently stores value over time, as well as being a convenient way for exchange. So its owner can dispense of it as she or she sees fit during that period of difference between selling something and buying something. So here's the crucial point in Marx's law of value. Where does profit come from then? Because clearly there is profit. How does this happen? Well, let's take the process that Marx talks about of the circulation of capital. Capitalists start off with money. They start off with money. That's what they start with. So capital takes the form of money, and then they invest it in the production of commodities. What commodities? Well, the means of production, the factories, the tools, the technology, the raw materials, and also another commodity, which is human labor power. They employ workers to produce these with the technology provided. And so what the workers are buying, so what the capitalists are buying, they own the means of production, they bought those, and then they're buying a certain amount of labor time from workers in order to create commodities which they'll sell onto the market. So as we see, they start off with M, they buy C, but they end up with more than N, the original N, they end up with M plus. And how is that possible? They will not make production, the capitalists, unless they do end up with more than they started with. So how does M become M plus? Well, it doesn't come from just the exchange process, says Marx. It's not a question of I exchange a car for some money or for some other object. That's just a fair exchange. It's a transfer of value taking place, which you've agreed is a fair exchange. It doesn't come from unfair exchange. If I jib you, if I sell you a car and it turns out to be useless and doesn't work, that's unfair exchange. But that's all that's happened there is the money that you had has been transferred to me, and I've managed to dupe you out of the value of the money that you had previously, which you've lost. So that doesn't create profit overall. That just means a transfer of money or profit between two different people. So it doesn't come from fair or unfair exchange. So where does it come from? Marx says it comes from surplus labor. And what does he mean by that? He's saying that before capitalism, as Marx argued, wherever a part of society possesses a monopoly of the means of production. The worker, free or unfree, must add to the labour time necessary for his own maintenance an extra quantity of labour time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owners of the means of production. So slaves, in a slave society, human beings are actually means of production, like horses. Their labour is completely free to the owner, who controls them entirely. In a feudal society, the serf on the land works a couple of days to keep himself alive with his small plot of land, but he spends the rest of the days and many other days working for the Lord for nothing. That's his role, and the Lord receives the produce on his land through the free work of the serf on 3 or 4 days out of the week. So that is two different ways in which there's surplus labour created. In the case of slave society, all the labour of the slave is surplus and free to the owner. In the case of a feudal society, a high proportion of a working week is free to the lord of the land without any exchange taking place. It's a free surplus of labour for the owners of the land and the controllers of serfs. But under capitalism, surplus labour turns into surplus value, says Marx. And what does he mean by that? The gap, he says, the surplus labour is created under capitalism. The gap is between the value of labour power in wages and the value of labour power delivered to the capitalist in the commodity sold. So if commodity is sold for $100 and the wages that the workers receive for that $100 to produce that commodity is 40, then there's a surplus value of 60. That's where the surplus labour appears. How does that possible for the capitalist to get that surplus value? And this is the crucial discovery that Marx makes in looking at the capitalist nature of surplus labour. It's hidden under capitalism. Workers are paid a fair day's wage for a fair day's work is the slogan. But we're not actually paid for our labour. We are paid for our labour power, our ability to produce and work. That's what we're paid for, and therein lies the rub, because you don't get paid for 8 hours work, you get paid for working 8 hours. And that's a big distinction between the value of labour in total, which is saying 8 hours work in a day, and the value of labour power, which will be less than those 8 hours in money terms, even though you're working 8 hours in a day. You could call this the money trick. Robert Tressel, who wrote an excellent book called The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, just sets out very clearly when he sits down with his fellow workers painting in I think it was Hastings, so one of our viewers today, thinking about how this trick took place. And it's Marx's great discovery to explain the production of surplus value. The secret hidden within the production process lies a special commodity of labour power, the ability to work, which is ours, but the exchange value of that labour power is paid out in a wage. The use value of the labour power is labour itself, the source of value. So let's say you work for Starbucks and they pay $120 for an 8-hour shift. You could probably make $100 worth of fancy coffee in an hour. But even if you subtract the cost of materials and use of equipment, Starbucks doesn't pay you anywhere near the value you've created of £100 a day. They buy your labour power from you, not the actual fruits of your labour. And you make that value back for them in an hour. The rest of your shift, you're basically working for free. So if we use the Marxist formula down here, there's the start off the money for the capitalist when he starts the process. And there is his extra money at the end of the process. How has that come about? He bought the commodities, the means of production, and the labour force. And the labour force produces, and it produces more value in the commodities produced than existed before, because there is a production by the workers. And that more value for the capitalist is because the capitalist does not pay the worker the full value of that extra production in labour time, only a proportion as in wages. So there, the surplus labour is turned into surplus value, and when the capitalist sells it on the market. So this is the nature of exploitation under capitalism. Exploitation has existed in previous societies. as we saw with slave society, serf society, exploitation being defined really as the control and extraction of surplus labor from the rest of the population by the owners of land or means of production and property. In capitalism, the basis of that extra surplus value can have two roads. First of all, there's raising the absolute surplus value. So if you can increase the working day and not change the wages that you're paying to the workers involved, then you're going to increase your surplus labor and your surplus value. So on the right-hand graph here, you can see an 8-hour day, say, split between wages here, necessary labor, necessary to be paid to the workers, and surplus labor, what the capitalist extracts. If he can increase the day from 8 hours to 12 hours and not change the wages, there's still the same amount of hours necessary to pay the workers' wages to keep them alive, but now they've increased the surplus labor available to the capitalists. So one of the big struggles in working class history has been the struggle to reduce the working day. And one of the resistances what capitalists make to reducing the working day is based precisely on it will mean a reduction in surplus value that they can extract from workers if there's no change in wages and the hours are simply reduced. And that is why even in modern society, if you look at the evidence, the working week or the working year over the last 30 or 40 years, despite technology, despite a huge increase in productivity, has not actually declined very much. It's still working 40 hours a week plus overtime on average in most countries around the world. So the first way to increase our surplus value is through increasing the working day. Of course, there are limits to this. There are human limits to the level at which people can be driven to work. A finite number in the day, for example, there's only 24 hours a day, and people still have to sleep, they still have to eat, they have to turn their bodies around to come out of the game. So there's a limit in physical terms about how much you could increase the working day. But also there's a limit in social and political terms. Labour will fight back to reduce the amount of toil they have to do, and they will organise to reduce that as best they can so they're not completely ruined. So workers' resistance, as Marx put it, is that obstinate yet elastic natural barrier to capital's ability to increase surplus value. The other major way of increasing surplus value is to increase relative surplus value. What does that mean? Well, that means the hours in the day have not been changed, but if it's possible to reduce the amount of necessary labour time going to the workers in wages, probably by reducing the cost of food and other ways in which labour power is reduced and so on, and therefore you can reduce the wages, then you can raise the rate of surplus value even within the same number of hours. So the length of the working day doesn't change, but surplus value produced does change. As Marx put it, for the production of relative surplus value, the necessary labour is shortened by methods of producing the equivalent of the wage of labour in a shorter time. So let's summarise this key discovery of Marx under the law of value, the nature of surplus value under capitalism, and the 4 ways, at least at this level, to raise the rate of surplus value. First, you can increase the intensity of work for labour, forcing them to deliver more out of value in the same amount of time by working them harder, time and motion, all the other methods which have been used historically to do that, to intensify the work activity by workers in the same amount. Then you can lower the value of labour power. In other words, if workers reproduce their necessary wages in fewer hours, how can you do that? Well, maybe productivity in the food and clothing and other necessary constituents going into the value of labour power fall because of faster production, higher productivity there. Then you can cheapen commodities for workers, and over time you could therefore reduce the amount you have to pay them in for them to survive. Third, you could de-skill jobs. As you saw, skilled workers tend to get more wages because they've got incorporated more hours in their labour power than unskilled workers. But if you can lower the amount of education and training necessary for workers, you could also reduce the value of labour power and their wages. And then you can actually drive wages below the existing value of labour power that is regarded as the average in a country. So we see that now in many countries around the world. In the advanced countries, we see it with the gig economy, 0 hours contracts, ways in which people are earning way, way less than was regarded as the average wage for the basis of an average amount of value of labour power. So there are 4 ways that the capitalists can drive up the rate of surplus value in relation between the necessary labour, the wages, and the price or the value of the commodities that are being sold on average. So to summarise, the law of value says is actually the best explanation of how prices of commodities in capitalist production appear and how they evolve round just how much, on average, socially necessary labour time goes in, on average, to produce the commodities in capitalist production in a capitalist economy. It explains where the law of value, where and how profit comes from, and why capitalist production is just another method of exploitation of labour by those exploiting those without property with those with the means of production. So bosses can also raise the rate of exploitation through increases in the productivity of labour, not just in the commodities that are necessary for workers to go, but right across the board. So more commodities are produced per worker per hour. That's going to raise the level of value that's being produced and therefore raise the amount of exploitation that bosses can gain in the process of producing for the market and commodities. How can that be done? That can be done by introducing new labour-saving technologies, by reducing the amount of labour that's necessary and replacing workers with machines in order to increase the productivity of labour, but also reducing the cost of the wage bill for the capitalists. And that's next time. In the next presentation, we will then deal with the question of capitalism competing in order to increase the accumulation of capital and to replace workers' labour time with machines that will increase the productivity of labour and keep wages down and wage costs down in general.